Thank you very much, and thank you very much for allowing me to be part of this wonderful community. I'm a pediatric neurologist in Washington, D.C., or close to Washington, D.C., aber ich bin natürlich deutscher Herkunft, also willkommen auch an die deutschsprachigen Familien hier, and I'll be taking questions in both languages at the end of it. So it's hard to give a talk with the word burden in the title just before lunch and after a morning of so many exciting therapeutic developments. But I do feel it is important to point out, I think, two things that also came up this morning. One is, what about the moms, the carrier females, and their medical conditions in MTM1, and what do families have to go through when they undergo a clinical trial in a disorder like MTM1? So this is just to bring everyone on the same page. We're going to focus here on MTM1 as an X-linked disorder, and X-linked disorder means that males have one X chromosome, females have two X chromosomes, and females can be carriers of a mutation on one copy of the X chromosome, but not be affected, and we call that X-linked recessive. And I will show you MTM1 is really not a pure X-linked recessive disorder. And then if there are offspring of this couple up here, these are the potential outcomes. You have an unaffected son, potentially an unaffected daughter with two normal copies from each parent. But you can also have a carrier daughter, and we'll talk about that more. And then, of course, a more severely affected son, because there is no second X chromosome to make up for the deficiency caused by the mutation on the first. And so this is a real MTM1 family. This is a family from our study at the NIH. And you can see these squares that are black are affected, severely affected boys with typical myotubular myopathy. And the bar across it, unfortunately, means all of these boys have passed away. But the circles with a dot, those are the carrier females in this family. And you can see that several things can happen. So you can have a carrier female who has another carrier female as a daughter, who then has two affected boys with the disease. Here is a pair of siblings affected carrier female was part of our study, and then a severely affected brother who passed away of the disease. And here is a carrier mom with just an affected boy here. So you can imagine all of this can occur also in isolation. So you have a mom who has two affected boys and doesn't know yet that she's a carrier. You can have a carrier mom who has no family history of myotubular myopathy and may never get a diagnosis until it's thought about. So this is the first recognition of this. This was 33 years ago, of a mother with myotubular myopathy that was actually clinically manifest. You can see she has facial weakness and it's asymmetric. This is a paper from Francesco and Heinz that shows that even in girls, this can actually also manifest very, very severely. So we're going to talk about that also, why that could happen. And this is a nice paper from Norma Romero in 2009 showing that in the muscle biopsy, you find these strange fibers here that are called necklace fibers because they look like a necklace with a pearl on a necklace. But we are having more and more awareness of this, and there's increased recognition of this. This is now the current tally of published cases. 67 cases are now recognized. Just last year, Jocelyn Laporte's group came out with a very nice series of 17 new cases to add to the female group of carriers. And then this study I'm going to show you today is 10 patients that are all new patients characterized at the NIH to understand what the level of involvement and the spectrum of involvement may be. So this is the study at the NIH, 10 all adult, 10 females with myotubular myopathy, ranging from, and we wanted to really capture the entire spectrum from non-manifesting, so these are carrying the gene mutation but are clinically completely normal, all the way to very severe involvement, precluding ambulation in this entire spectrum over mild and moderate. And this diagram here shows dark muscles here are normal muscles, and the more pale they get, the more affected they are. You can see that there's a range of being more and more affected, mostly in the muscles that are close to the shoulder or the hips. We call that a limb girdle pattern of involvement. And you can measure that also with the motor function measure outcome, so you can objectify it, showing that the more severe the manifestation is, the more poor the motor performance that you can measure with a tool that can also be used in clinical trials. Hint, hint. And then one striking aspect that we've, and others also found in a number of carrier females is asymmetry. So that one, and so this mom here is trying to raise her arms, and that works perfectly well on the right, but not on the left, because there's striking asymmetry in the muscle involvement. And the asymmetry can even extend to the skeleton, so there can be skeletal asymmetries. You can see here, this hand here is much smaller than the right hand here, similar here. And here's one mom who's most severely affected and has lost the ability to ambulate. And importantly, this disease is progressive, so it's not a static situation. This actually gets worse over the years with increasing muscle weakness as the disease goes on. You can see that also in imaging the muscle in muscle MRI. So here is a muscle MRI of the calf of one of those females. White muscle is affected muscle, dark muscle is normal muscle, and if you just look at the calf here, you can see how striking the asymmetry is in this, and we don't quite understand why that is. Let me just come back to a few basics of this. So females have 2 X chromosomes in every cell, and every cell makes a decision, a random decision, to turn off 1 X chromosome, because you only need 1 X chromosome active in the cell, and that process is random. So it's called random X inactivation. As a result of that, every tissue is a mosaic of either 1X on or 1X off, and that could be the maternal or the paternal. So that's a normal situation. You have a mosaic of cells with either 1X chromosome on or off, and that usually results in no problem. However, if this process is no longer completely random but is skewed for whatever reason, you may end up in a situation where the normal X chromosome is preferentially turned off and the abnormal X chromosome with the mutation on it is preferentially on. So then that mosaic is skewed, and more cells express an X chromosome that has the mutation in the tubular gene, and then you have a manifestation of the disease because there's not enough normal to make up for it. So that's called skewed, or no longer random X inactivation, skewed X inactivation. And of course the question is the degree of manifestation in our manifesting carriers dependent on the degree of X inactivation that we can measure in the blood? And the answer is no, it's not. So the degree of X inactivation does not correlate, that we can measure in the blood, does not correlate with the degree of affection of females. So here is the X inactivation. This is completely skewed, and this is random X inactivation. And you can see in our study, our manifesting females as well as the non-manifesting are just distributed here as if this was random. And filling it in from the literature, you can see it is completely random here. It doesn't mean that something else could be happening in the muscle itself that is different from what we measure in the blood. But on the other hand, there's also other mechanisms one has to consider, which is that on every X chromosome that is turned off in the random X inactivation, there's certain genes that are left on by design, and that is called X inactivation escape. So it is possible and should be studied whether in some cases our mutant MTM1 escapes X inactivation so that it stays on and therefore causes the problem. So that's for the labs to figure out. But as a conclusion of this part of my talk, this is a disease. Carrier status of MTM1 can manifest as a disease. It can be progressive over the years, can stay asymptomatic, but can have severe weakness that shouldn't be underestimated. It may be underdiagnosed because it can occur in females without a family history, and so some of the signs like the asymmetry can be very good clinical clues to look for that. So it is probably a more prevalent myopathy than we have thought. And as a matter of fact, we just diagnosed a sporadic manifesting female with MT1 mutation at NIH just recently. It should be included in considerations of therapeutic development, and I think some of you have raised this morning. And it adds also as an acknowledged burdens of mothers with tubular myopathy of children with more severe disease. So this part is really the work of Regan Foley, who is at NIH with us, and many of you know from her time here in London, as well as a great team of collaborators here, supported by the CMDIR, who looked for patients, and of course all the females and moms who came to the NIH to be examined in this way. So let me then switch gears and talk about another burden, which is the burden on families and perhaps clinical trial teams on doing a clinical trial in this particular patient population. And my focus here is really patient-centered and family centers, and also clinical trial team centers. And of course, there are burdens also on people who develop the trials, the sponsors, and the industry that supports it, but that's not my topic here. Clinical trials are happening now. And they will be ranging from something super exciting like a gene therapy trial, but also to trials that may be less exciting on first glance, like a natural history study or a phenotypic study, or just to be examined to know what the disease causes over time. And then there can be pharmacological intervention that we've heard about as well. Jim mentioned that. So clinical trials come in a multitude of different designs, and they are particularly difficult to design in situations where patients are rare. And even though this room here, this conference, is full of families with children or affected people with myotubular or centronuclear myopathies, overall it is an ultra-rare disease. If you talk to anyone out there, they say, ooh, this is super, if not ultra-rare. But you still have to be able to do clinical trials in that. But traditional clinical trial designs like in hypertension or diabetes no longer apply. There are far too few patients for that. And so we have to rely on natural history data. That's why these kind of boring trials of natural history are super important as well, to understand the disease, to allow for clinical therapeutic trials to happen. There is various ways to deal with placebo or non-treatment arms of it without causing undue non-treatment of patients. So one is in the Aspira trial that you heard of, delayed treatment. So you wait with the treatment, ultimately the patient will get it. Usually these designs have more treated than placebo patients in them. There's crossover designs like Jim showed in the tamoxifen, and there is open label extension, so that there is a chance for everyone to be on the trial drug in the end. A trial site will always be sparse. They need high expertise to carefully do these trials. So that raises burdens of simple trial logistics. So your clinical trial site may be far away. So you saw in the Aspira trial, there is one site for England, there's one site for France, one site for Germany, and yet the patients are not necessarily naturally living very close to it, which means travel can be long, and that travel can be remote. And if you have a child with lots of medical needs, that puts certainly a burden on just getting there. The scheduler at the site needs to make sure everything really happens when the family is there at the site, and longer stays at the clinical site may be needed to get everything done that the trial requires you to do. And then in particular in the US, insurance coverage can be variable from state to state within the US. So the patient has normal and good coverage in one state, comes to another state where the trial is happening, and then all of a sudden there's no proper insurance coverage anymore. And so all of that needs to be considered as well. So that poses challenges to the trial team as well. So I told you everything has to be just ready, but the team has to be flexible, because you have to accommodate changes in schedule as they happen when the patient is there. Testing has to be done to minimize fatigue and ensure that the children are still cooperative at the end of this ordeal. There is variability in the testing if you do it really on command at a particular morning when it has to happen, such as respiratory testing that the patient and the family has no control over. Medical standards of care vary widely depending on where the family comes from. So the respiratory baseline care may be very different from patient to patient depending where the patient comes from, and yet the clinical outcomes that we want to measure are the same for all of them. So we have to take that into account. And then there is a burden on the actual patient, or in our case, most often a child, which can be both medical but also emotional. There is a medical fragility that's inherent in the severe forms of this disease. Fatigue has a huge effect on outcome measures. There's an unfamiliar environment. The patient, the boy, may not sleep properly because everything is so foreign, and then performs much poorer at the next day. Often there is prolonged periods of time when the friends are not there and the school is not there, and there is a frightening environment that's medically intense. So that is a burden that one has to really take into account to ensure that the outcome measures are actually functional and not falsely abnormal. As a burden on the family, it's an economic burden. You're losing work and you're straining your personal resources trying to participate. And there's also an emotional burden. You see the child go through relentless medical testing often. You're hoping for a benefit, but there's no guarantee. The siblings have to take second place in all of this, and they may be stressed by that as well, as do relatives. So it's a constant focus that's necessary on this affecting. And then who's taking care of the caregivers, in particular if moms have their own medical needs in that. And then there is the, can I have one more, 30 seconds? Yeah, because so there is expectation, hopes, and concerns. The expectations, naturally, when you come out of a meeting like this, hearing about the gene therapy and the therapeutics and development are high, sometimes enormously so. And realistically, you can have realistic expectations, you can have overly optimistic ones and overly pessimistic ones. As Jim pointed out, a clinical trial is still a trial, so it is a clinical experiment that you participate in with expectation of benefit but no guarantee. So the pressure, on the other hand, is enormous to act. If you have a child that is affected, you want to do everything that's possible, every chance that is out there to help and be participating in these trials, but not put the child at unnecessary risk. And then that's what I often hear, what is there to lose? You know, this is a child with a severe disease. So the responsibility is great. You have to be a constant advocate for the child, but who's going to help you in making these decisions in an unbiased and good way? Do I make this alone with the doctors, with patient advocacy, or with peers? And this is my last slide, which is the slide that is the challenge of communications as they happen and must happen in a rare disease community like ours. So there are constraints by people involved in these trials as to what is allowed to be communicated, what can be said publicly. And Suyash pointed that out. You know, it's a publicly traded company, for instance. You can't say anything that you want to say. But there has to be a feeling of honesty to the patients, to the families, to the organization. That's of great importance to build a therapeutic unit that moves forward together with this. In conclusion and exclusion criteria are often painful. If you hear that your child cannot participate because this lab value is out of whack, so sorry, you cannot participate. That needs to be explained and clearly communicated. And there will be patients who are fulfilling exclusion criteria but cannot yet be enrolled because the trial slots are too few. And that also needs to be managed in a very compassionate way by the sponsor, as well as the trial team responsible for direct communications to the patients. And this is an important point as well. How do you, as a participant in a trial, communicate with friends and your networks? There is an impact of communication. If you're in the trial, if you're not in the trial, what you broadcast out there and how you communicate with your patient community. If you're on a wait list and you're disappointed, you're nervous, you're really upset. And also in terms of what you experience in the trial itself, improvement, maybe adverse effects, how do you communicate that in a way that doesn't jeopardize you, the trial, and everyone else? And so those are the powers and dangers of the use of social media in that. Food for thought for lunch, and I'll open the discussion at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much.